When I woke up, everything felt like a blur. My eyes opened, but the world around me was out of focus. I could hear the faint beeping of machines, the hum of the hospital, and the distant chatter of nurses, but none of it made sense. My body felt heavy, like it wasn't mine, and I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like I was trapped inside my own body, unable to escape, unable to do anything. The only thing I was aware of was the sound. The sound of machines keeping me alive, and the sound of my own thoughts, racing through my head. But then I heard something that made everything inside me freeze. It was a conversation, one that came from the hallway outside my room. I don't know how, but I could hear every word clearly. It was my parents. They were talking to the doctors. I could barely make out the words at first, but then it became clear. My parents were standing outside my room, and they were telling the doctors, "He won't make it anyway." That was it. That was what they said about me. Their own son, lying in a hospital bed, clinging to life, and they had already given up on me. They were ready to let me go, like it didn't matter. The doctors had told them that I was in a coma, that my chances of survival were slim, but to hear those words from my own parents, it was the kind of betrayal I couldn't have imagined. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that I was lying there, helpless, or the fact that they had already written me off. They had given up, just like that. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move, but in my head, I was screaming. I wanted to jump out of that bed and shout at them, to tell them how wrong they were, to show them that I wasn't finished, that I wasn't going to give up, but my body refused to cooperate. All I could do was lie there, completely still, as the words from my parents echoed in my mind. And then it hit me. It wasn't just about them giving up on me. It was about the years of my life that had led up to this moment. The years of feeling invisible, of feeling like I wasn't good enough. My parents had always been like this, critical, demanding, never satisfied. It was never enough to make them proud. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, it was always something. Always a reason to criticize, always a reason to tear me down. But hearing them talk like this, so dismissive, so ready to let me go, it was the final straw. It was the moment when I realized that I had spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, but they didn't deserve it. They didn't deserve me. The next few days were a blur. I could hear voices, the sound of footsteps, the faint murmur of conversations around me. But it was all just noise. I was stuck in that in-between space, where nothing felt real. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And yet, I was acutely aware of everything. I could feel the weight of their words, the weight of their indifference. It was suffocating. But after what felt like an eternity, I woke up. My body was weak, my mind foggy, but I was awake. I was alive. I don't know how long it had been since I first fell into the coma, but it didn't matter. I was back. And yet, everything felt different. I didn't feel the same. I wasn't the same person who had gone into that coma. The moment I heard my parents' words, something inside me had changed. I didn't know it at the time, but I wasn't going to let that moment define me. I wasn't going to let them control my life anymore. The first few weeks after I woke up were a blur. I was in the hospital for a long time, recovering physically, but mentally, I was a wreck. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I couldn't forget what they'd said. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard their words. "He won't make it anyway." It was a phrase that haunted me, a reminder that I wasn't important enough to them. A reminder that, in their eyes, I was disposable. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't do anything. I couldn't bring myself to. They had already shown me who they were. They had shown me how little I meant to them, and I wasn't ready to forgive them. Not yet. Not after everything. 5 years passed. 5 long years. I spent that time trying to rebuild my life, to find some sense of purpose, to pick up the pieces of who I had been before all of this. I worked on myself. I focused on my career. I focused on getting better, physically and mentally. But the truth was, no matter how much I tried to move on, I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't forget the betrayal, and in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was forgiveness, or maybe it was just a sense of peace that I didn't know how to find. And then, one night, everything changed. I was attending a fundraising event, one of those charity events for families at risk of losing their homes. It was a cause I believed in, and I had been a regular donor for years. But that night, something unexpected happened. As I walked through the event, greeting familiar faces and talking to people. I saw them, my parents. They were standing in the crowd, looking out of place. Tired, older, worn down. The years hadn't been kind to them. I barely recognized them at first. The image of my parents had been frozen in time, but seeing them there, looking so different, made it clear that life had taken its toll. I don't know what made me do it, but I couldn't look away. There they were, standing in the same room as me, and they didn't even know I was there. And for a moment, I wanted to stay invisible. I wanted to turn around and walk away, to forget I had seen them, to leave them to deal with their own problems. But something stopped me. Something inside me said, "This is it. This is your chance." It was like a switch flipped, and I knew in that moment that I had a choice to make. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew what I could do in that moment. I could ignore them, I could stay angry, or I could do something that would change everything. I took a deep breath and made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them fall. Not after everything that had happened. I wasn't going to let them lose everything. They didn't deserve to lose their home, even if they didn't deserve my forgiveness. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I donated. I donated enough money to save their home. It wasn't just the money that I donated, it was more than that. It was a decision that had been brewing inside me for years. It wasn't an easy choice, and it didn't come without its own internal struggle. You see, when I first walked into that fundraising event and saw my parents standing there, I was overwhelmed with so many conflicting emotions. Resentment, a deep, aching betrayal that I didn't know how to shake. But as I looked at them, something shifted. I realized that, despite everything they had done, despite everything they had said, I still had the power to change the narrative. In that moment, I made the conscious decision to not let my past define me. I could have walked away. I could have let the anger and hurt consume me. It would have been so easy to pretend like they didn't exist, to ignore the fact that they needed help. But something told me that if I did that, I would be no better than the people I had always accused them of being. I wasn't going to be someone who just walked away from their family when they were in trouble. I wasn't going to be someone who let bitterness and pride control my actions. I refused to let that happen. So, I made a decision. I walked up to the donation table, asked for the highest donation amount, and gave it. I didn't even think about it. It was just something I did, something I knew deep down was the right thing to do. My donation was more than just a financial transaction. It was a symbol of strength, a symbol of choosing to be better, despite the years of pain and disappointment. And it was a way to show them that I was in control, not them. At that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't a magic fix, and it didn't make everything better, but it was a step. It was a step toward healing, a step toward moving past the anger. And even though I still didn't know if I could ever forgive them fully, I knew I had made the right choice. I didn't expect anything in return. I didn't expect a thank you, and I certainly didn't expect a grand gesture of gratitude. I didn't do it for them, I did it for me. I did it because, for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was the one who had the power. I was the one who could decide how my story would unfold. Not them, not the hurt they caused, and not the bitterness that had consumed me for years. A few weeks passed, and I didn't hear anything from my parents. I didn't expect to. They didn't even know who had made the donation, and I planned to keep it that way. I wasn't looking for recognition. I didn't need them to know. I didn't need them to thank me. I just needed to know that I had done the right thing. That was enough for me. But then, one day, I got a message. It wasn't from anyone I knew personally, but it was a message that I never expected. It was from my mother. It was short, almost too brief, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. She said, "Thank you for helping us. We don't deserve it, but we are grateful." Those words were like a punch to the gut. I hadn't heard from her in so long, and when I did, it was a simple, emotionless message. But it was enough. It was enough to stir something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see me as a person again. Not just as a failure, not just as someone they had written off, but as their son. It was a step toward reconciliation, and while I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, it was a start. I thought about the message for a long time. It was simple, but it carried so much weight. I didn't know what I expected from them. I didn't know if I wanted them to apologize, or if I even wanted their apology. But the fact that they acknowledged my help, that they recognized what I had done for them, meant something. It was a crack in the wall that had been built between us, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to tear it down yet. But at least the wall wasn't as high as it had been before. The days went by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to change. Not just with my parents, but with myself. For years, I had held on to the anger, the hurt, and the resentment. I had let those feelings define me, control me, and keep me from moving forward. But donating that money, making that choice to help them, was like a release. It was like I had finally let go of all the weight I had been carrying for so long. It wasn't just about them. It was about me, about finding peace, about finding a way to move on from the past. But there was still one thing that lingered. The truth. The truth about everything that had happened between us. The truth about how they had treated me. How they had given up on me when I needed them most. And while I had made the decision to help them, to be better than my past, I knew that the truth still needed to come out. I couldn't just move forward without confronting it. I couldn't just pretend like everything was fine. I didn't know how it would happen, but I knew that one day the truth would come to light. And when it did, I would be ready. Ready to face whatever came my way. Because, at that point, I had nothing left to lose. I had already made the hardest decision of my life. I had already chosen to move past my anger. And whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected call from my mother. This time, it wasn't a text. It wasn't a short message. It was a phone call. She asked if we could meet. She said she wanted to talk. And in that moment, I realized that the moment I had been waiting for was finally here. It was time to face the past, time to confront everything that had been left unsaid, and I knew that I was ready. When I agreed to meet my mother, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me felt a sense of relief, like this was the closure I had been waiting for. Another part of me was still on edge, unsure of how everything would unfold. We hadn't talked in years, and even though I had helped them, even though I had made the decision to move forward, there was still so much unsaid between us. The weight of everything, the hurt, the betrayal, the years of silence, it still hung in the air, like an unspoken truth that neither of us had ever been willing to confront. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe in the downtown area, a place I used to go to when I was younger. It was familiar, and that made it feel less intimidating. I arrived early, my nerves simmering beneath the surface. I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what was coming, but I knew I had to face it. This was the moment I had been building up to for so long. The moment where I would finally hear them out. The moment where everything could change. I sat at a corner table, my fingers tracing the rim of my coffee cup, trying to steady my thoughts. It felt surreal, like I was waiting for a bomb to drop. What would she say? Would she apologize for everything? Would she try to explain the years of neglect and emotional distance? I had no idea, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I was already bracing myself for the possibility that things wouldn't go the way I hoped. And then, I saw her. My mother, walking through the cafe door, her face etched with age and worry. She looked different, but not in the way I expected. She wasn't the same woman I remembered, the one who was always quick with criticism, who never seemed to care about how I felt. This woman, standing before me now, looked tired, weighed down by the years that had passed. Her eyes were heavy with something I couldn't place, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Regret, maybe? Or maybe just the wear and tear of life catching up to her. When she saw me, there was a flicker of hesitation. For a moment, we both stood there, unsure of what to do. But then she walked over to the table, and we sat down. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she just looked at me, like she was searching for something, maybe an apology, maybe forgiveness. But I wasn't ready to give either of those just yet. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel my heart racing, and I could tell she was just as nervous as I was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I don't know where to begin," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I've thought about this moment so many times. I've thought about all the things I should have said to you, all the things I should have done differently, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for what I did to you, for the way we treated you, for the way I treated you. It is love." Those words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I wasn't sure how to react. A part of me wanted to burst out in anger, to tell her how much I had suffered because of her, how her words had haunted me every single day. But another part of me knew that this moment wasn't about rehashing the past. It was about understanding, about finding a way to move forward. I could feel the years of resentment building up inside me, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time for that. I don't expect you to forgive me, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I need you to know that I regret everything. I regret not being there for you when you needed me most. I regret the things I said, the things I didn't say, and I know I can never take it back, but I want to do better. I want to make things right, if you'll let me. I sat there, taking in her words, letting them sink in. It was strange. For years, I had been waiting for this. For years, I had held on to the anger, the hurt, and the resentment. I had carried it around like a weight, and I had convinced myself that I would never let it go. But now, sitting here in front of her, I realized something. I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't making me stronger. It was making me weaker. It was holding me back from moving forward. I took a deep breath and looked her in the eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly. I don't know if I ever will. But I don't want to hold on to this anymore. I don't want to carry this pain with me. I don't want to let it control me. She nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I understand, she whispered. I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm here now, and I want to try. I want to be a better mother to you. I know I can never make up for the past, but I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me. There was a long pause as we both sat there, letting the weight of everything settle in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was seeing her clearly, like I was seeing her as a person, not just as a mother who had hurt me. She was flawed, just like I was. She had made mistakes, just like I had. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to move past it. Maybe there was a way for us to start fresh, to rebuild what had been broken. The conversation didn't end with a dramatic resolution or a perfect moment of forgiveness. It wasn't a neat and tidy conclusion to all the years of pain, but it was a start. A small, tentative step toward healing. And sometimes that's all you need, a step. It might not be the whole journey, but it's a start. As I left the cafe that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't a promise that everything would be fixed overnight, and it didn't mean that all the wounds from the past would magically disappear. But it was a glimmer of light, something to hold on to. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own story. I didn't have to let the past define me anymore. I didn't have to let the hurt control my future. And that's when I realized no matter how broken things may seem, no matter how much pain you've been through, you always have the power to choose how you move forward. You always have the power to rewrite your story. As I left the cafe, the air outside felt different. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for so long had lifted, just a little. It wasn't gone, not completely, but the conversation with my mother had cracked the foundation of resentment I'd built over the years. It wasn't an overnight fix, and I wasn't expecting it to be, but it was a step. And sometimes, that's all you need. A step forward, no matter how small, can lead to bigger changes down the road. I didn't know what would happen after that day. I didn't know if I was ready to welcome my mother back into my life fully, or if I even wanted to. Part of me still felt the anger, the hurt, and the bitterness. It wasn't something that would disappear just because we'd had one honest conversation. But at least there was a crack in the wall we'd built between us. At least there was a hint of something real, something we hadn't had for years. And that gave me hope. Over the next few weeks, I tried to process everything. I spent a lot of time thinking about what had been said, what had been left unsaid. I realized that I wasn't just forgiving her. I was forgiving myself too. For years, I had carried around so much anger, so much pain, that I couldn't see past it. I had built walls, not just around my mother, but around myself. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that I didn't need them, that I didn't need anyone. But the truth was, I did. I didn't want to live the rest of my life in isolation, wrapped up in the past, unable to move forward. And while I wasn't ready to fully open the door to a relationship with my parents, I knew I had to take the next step. I had to reach out, just a little bit. It didn't mean everything was forgiven, and it didn't mean I was ready to forget the years of hurt. But it was a start. A small, tentative start toward rebuilding something that I never thought could be fixed. I decided to invite my parents to dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple meal at my apartment, something casual. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew it was time to see them again. It had been years since we sat down together like that, and I had no idea what the evening would hold. But I was willing to try. For me, for them, for the chance to see if we could rebuild what had been broken. The day of the dinner, I was a bundle of nerves. I spent hours cleaning my apartment, making sure everything was perfect. I wanted it to be a safe space, a place where we could talk without distractions. But no matter how much I cleaned, no matter how much I prepared, I couldn't shake the nervous energy that was coursing through me. I wasn't sure what to expect from them, or from myself. Would I be able to handle it? Would I be able to keep my emotions in check? When they arrived, I could tell that they were nervous too. My mother had on a soft smile, but her eyes were wary, like she wasn't sure how I would respond to her. My father was quieter than usual, and there was a tension in his posture, like he wasn't sure how to act. We all stood there in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say. It was like we were all testing the waters, trying to figure out what the next step was. Finally, I broke the silence. "Come in," I said, trying to sound casual. "Dinner's ready." Hings. They both stepped inside, and we sat down to eat. The conversation started off slow, awkward even. We didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. It wasn't like before, when everything was easy, when we could joke and laugh together without a care in the world. Now, it felt like we were all walking on eggshells, trying not to step on anything that would make things worse. But as the evening went on, something started to shift. The conversation gradually became less stiff, less forced. We talked about small things, nothing too deep, nothing too heavy. We talked about work, about family, about how we had been spending our time over the years. But with every passing minute, the walls that had been built between us started to crumble. Slowly, but surely, we began to reconnect. At some point during dinner, my mother spoke up again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, looking directly at me. "About us not being there for you when you needed us, and I've realized that I wasn't just failing you as a mother, I was failing myself too. I had so many chances to reach out, to make things right, and I didn't. I was too proud, too scared to admit that I was wrong." Her words hit me harder than I expected. There was something in the way she spoke that made me realize just how much she had been carrying all these years. It wasn't just me who had been hurt by the distance between us. She had been hurt too. She had made mistakes, yes, but she wasn't the only one who had failed. I had failed too. I had held onto my anger for so long that I couldn't see the person in front of me, the person who was, at the end of the day, just human. Just a mother who made mistakes, like we all do. My father, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke. "I wasn't there for you either," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I thought that by staying out of the way, I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I should have been there for you, supporting you. I should have been more present. I didn't know how to fix things, and I didn't know how to reach out, but I should have tried." It was like a weight had been lifted from my chest. Hearing them both admit their mistakes was something I hadn't expected, but it was exactly what I needed. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. They were trying to make things right, and that meant something. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be fixed, that we would be the family we once were, but it was a start, and that was enough. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and laughter. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally seeing my parents for who they truly were, flawed, but trying. They weren't the people I had built them up to be in my mind, the villains of my story. They were just two people who had made mistakes, just like I had. And for the first time, I saw them as humans, not just as parents. As they left that night, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a grand epiphany, and it didn't solve all our problems, but it was a step. And sometimes, that's all you need, a step forward. We were no longer stuck in the past. We were no longer drowning in the weight of old hurts. We were moving forward, together, and I realized something that night: healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it, accepting it, and finding a way to move on. It's about taking control of your own story, and not letting the pain of yesterday dictate your tomorrow. After that dinner, everything felt different. It wasn't like a sudden wave of perfection had washed over us, but there was something tangible in the air, something that hadn't been there in years. hope, a sense of possibility. For the first time in a long time, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild. It wasn't going to happen overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy. But there was a foundation now. There was a seed planted, and with time, it might grow into something stronger than what we had before. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about what had transpired. The conversations, the awkward moments, the apologies, it all felt like a lot to process, but also like the beginning of something new. I realized that while I had been waiting for a magical solution, for some grand gesture of forgiveness that would make everything right, the reality was much simpler. Healing was about the little things. It was about showing up, being there, and taking things one step at a time. And that was something I could work with. It wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about learning how to coexist with the past and make peace with it. As the weeks went on, I continued to keep in touch with my parents. The calls were brief at first, awkward even, but they were calls nonetheless. We didn't dive into anything too heavy right away. We talked about the basics, the weather, work, the things you talk about when you're trying to ease back into someone's life. It felt strange, almost like we were strangers getting to know each other all over again. But that was okay. It was necessary. I knew we needed this time to rebuild the trust that had been broken, even if it wasn't easy. One of the most difficult things I had to confront during this time was the guilt I felt. Guilt for being angry for so long. Guilt for keeping them at arm's length when they had reached out. Guilt for not seeing the hurt they had been carrying all these years. But in a way, I also realized that this guilt was a byproduct of something larger, the need for validation. For so long, I had been seeking validation from them. I had been holding on to the idea that if they acknowledged my pain, if they apologized for what they did, then everything would be okay. But the truth was, validation wasn't what I needed. What I needed was to take responsibility for my own healing. I needed to stop waiting for them to fix things for me and start fixing things for myself. And so, I made the decision to let go of the guilt. I told myself that it was okay to feel hurt, but it wasn't okay to let that hurt control me anymore. I wasn't going to let the past keep me stuck in a cycle of bitterness and anger. I wasn't going to let it dictate how I lived my life. I wasn't going to let it take away the possibility of a better future. As I continued to process everything, I also began to notice the subtle changes in my parents. They were trying. They were showing up in ways I hadn't expected. My father, who had always been distant, started calling me more often. He asked about my day, about my work, about the little things that, in the past, he had never bothered to ask. My mother, too, was making an effort. She was no longer the critical, distant woman I remembered. She was softer, more open, more willing to listen. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I could see the change in them, and it made me realize something important. People can change. They don't always change in the ways you expect, and it doesn't happen in an instant. But people are capable of growth. They are capable of learning from their mistakes. It took time for them to see where they had gone wrong, but they were trying now. And that was something I hadn't expected. But with these changes came new challenges. As my parents worked to rebuild their relationship with me, I realized that I needed to start rebuilding my relationship with myself. For so long, I had been caught up in the narrative of victimhood, the story I had told myself about how they had hurt me, how they had abandoned me, and while that narrative was valid, it wasn't the whole story. The truth was, I had also played a role in our fractured relationship. I had shut myself off, closed myself off from the possibility of healing, and held on to my anger for far too long. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that I needed to forgive myself too. I needed to stop punishing myself for the choices I had made in the past. I needed to accept that I had done the best I could with the information I had at the time, and now it was time to move forward. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but little by little, I started to make peace with myself. One evening, about a month after that first dinner, I sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't a letter to my parents, though. It was a letter to myself. I wrote about everything I had been through, all the pain I had carried, all the hurt I had felt, but also about how far I had come. I wrote about the lessons I had learned about forgiveness, about healing, about the importance of letting go of the past. I wrote about how much I had grown, even though it didn't always feel like it. When I finished the letter, I felt something inside me shift. It was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I wasn't carrying around all the resentment anymore. I wasn't holding on to the anger that had defined so much of my life. I had let go, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The next day, I went to visit my parents. It wasn't anything extraordinary. We just sat and talked, like we used to. But there was something different about it. The tension that had once been there was gone, replaced by a sense of ease, of understanding. We were still working through things, still figuring it all out, but we were doing it together. And that, I realized, was the most important thing. In that moment, I understood something crucial. Healing is not linear. It doesn't follow a clear path, and it doesn't happen in a straight line. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it takes years. But as long as you keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps are, you're still moving, and that's enough. As I left their house that day, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough. I wasn't expecting everything to be fixed overnight. I wasn't expecting a fairy tale ending. But I was learning to be okay with the journey. I was learning that healing isn't about perfection, it's about progress. It's about doing the best you can with what you have, and trusting that one day the pieces will come together. The weeks after that dinner, I began to feel like I was navigating a new chapter in my life, one that was still unfolding. It wasn't clear-cut, and it wasn't simple, but it was moving. Slowly but steadily, I began to accept the reality that the healing process was much longer than I had anticipated. It wasn't just about forgiving my parents, it was about forgiving myself and learning how to live with the imperfections of our relationship. I had spent so much of my life trying to control the narrative, trying to rewrite the past, and I had failed to realize that the past wasn't something you could change. But the future? That was still unwritten, and that was where my focus needed to be. I found myself in a place I hadn't expected, a place of balance. I wasn't holding on to the bitterness anymore, but I wasn't pretending that everything was fine either. It wasn't about sweeping the hurt under the rug or pretending that nothing had happened. It was about acknowledging the past and then choosing to move forward. It was about understanding that the road to healing wasn't straight, and that was okay. It wasn't long before I started to feel a shift in my daily life as well. The weight that I had carried for so many years, the anger, the sadness, the resentment, it began to feel lighter. The little things that used to set me off, the things that would make me snap in frustration, started to matter less. I was learning to take things in stride, to breathe through moments of tension, to not react impulsively, but instead to respond thoughtfully. It wasn't perfect, and I wasn't perfect, but I was learning. One of the most surprising changes came in my relationship with my work. For years, I had poured myself into my career as a way of avoiding the unresolved feelings I had about my family. Work had been my escape, my way of not dealing with the emotions I didn't want to confront. But now, something had shifted. I felt more focused, more present. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was doing my job with purpose. I was making decisions that felt aligned with who I truly was, not just what I thought I should be. I started taking more risks, pushing myself in ways I hadn't before. I opened myself up to new opportunities that scared me. I found myself saying yes to things I would have normally turned down. I felt more alive than I had in years, more connected to my passions, more willing to embrace the discomfort that came with growth. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I wasn't running from my past anymore. I wasn't running from the fear of failure or rejection. I was standing in the present, facing my future with a sense of openness. But as much as I had made progress, there were still moments when the past crept back into my thoughts. The anger, the hurt, the fear, it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I knew that I wasn't over it. I knew that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that would continue for the rest of my life. And I also knew that there would be setbacks, moments where I'd feel like I had taken 2 steps back instead of forward. One day, as I was scrolling through my phone, I saw a notification from my mother. She had sent me a message, just a simple text, but it was enough to make my heart race. It read, "I've been thinking about you a lot. I know we haven't talked much lately, but I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. I see how far you've come, and I'm proud of the person you've become. No matter what, I'll always be here for you." There's mine. I don't know why, but those words hit me hard. It wasn't just the sentiment, it was the sincerity behind it. I had spent so many years waiting for this moment, the moment when she would finally acknowledge my growth, when she would finally see me for who I was, not just as her child. But even more than that, it was the fact that she had sent this message on her own, without me prompting it. It wasn't something I had to ask for. It wasn't something I had to beg for. It was her way of showing me that she recognized the effort I had put into healing, into growing, and that she was willing to support me. For a moment, I felt a flood of emotions, relief, pride, and yes, a bit of sadness too. But most of all, I felt a sense of closure. Not final closure, because that would come in time, but closure on a certain chapter. My mother wasn't perfect. She wasn't the mother I had dreamed of when I was younger, and she wasn't the person I had hoped she would be. But she was trying, and that mattered. She had taken the first step, and now it was up to me to continue down the path. I responded to her text, not with a long explanation, but with a simple, "Thank you. That means a lot." I didn't need to say more. The message was enough. The conversation didn't have to be long or deep, it just had to be real. And that was something we were both learning to do. Be real with each other. Over the next few months, I continued to work on myself, to strengthen my relationship with my parents, and to accept that healing was never going to be a linear process. Some days were easier than others. Some days, I still struggled with the pain of the past. But I knew that I was stronger for having gone through it. And I knew that I was on the right path. One of the most powerful lessons I learned during this journey was that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that the past didn't happen or that the wounds aren't still there. It means learning how to live with the pain, how to let it shape you into a stronger, more compassionate person. Healing is about accepting that you don't have to be perfect, and neither do the people around you. It's about acknowledging your flaws, your mistakes, and the mistakes of others, and then choosing to move forward with grace. I also learned that, sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the most. But that doesn't mean they don't love us. It means that they, too, are flawed, and they, too, are doing the best they can. My parents weren't perfect, and I wasn't perfect either. But we were both trying, and that was enough. The healing process wasn't just about me forgiving them. It was about understanding that we all have our own battles, our own struggles. We all make mistakes, and we all deserve a chance to try again. The road to healing wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. It took time to rebuild trust, time to work through the pain, time to learn how to love again, even after everything that had happened. But in the end, I knew that it was worth it. The journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing through it, and using it to create a better future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own story. As the days turned into months, I started to feel a sense of balance that had been missing from my life for so long. The anger that had once burned so fiercely inside me was no longer a constant companion. It wasn't gone completely. Of course, it never truly disappears, but it no longer controlled me. I had found a way to live with it, to understand it, and to manage it. I could look at my parents without the sharp edge of resentment. I could speak to them without the weight of years of unspoken words pressing on my chest. The relationship between my parents and me wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was evolving. It wasn't a smooth path, and there were still bumps along the way. We had difficult conversations. We still disagreed. But I could see the effort on both sides. They were trying. They were showing up in ways they never had before, and that was something I hadn't expected. In the past, I would have pushed them away, kept them at arm's length. But now, I was choosing to open myself up, even when it was difficult. I was choosing to see them as flawed human beings, just like me, and not as the perfect parents I had imagined them to be. One evening, about 6 months after that dinner, I sat down with my parents again, this time in a more casual setting, just the three of us, sitting on the couch, talking. There was no grand apology, no dramatic confessions, just a quiet acknowledgement that we were all in this together. For the first time, I felt like we were truly communicating not just the surface-level conversations we had in the past, but something deeper. It was like we were all peeling back layers of our emotions, letting the rawness of our feelings be seen, even though it was uncomfortable. My mother was the first to speak. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the things we've gone through," she said, her voice soft, "about how much we've all been through and how much we've changed." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "I can't undo the past, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I hope, in time, you can see that I've tried, that I'm trying." I listened, Her words weren't perfect, but they were real. They weren't about fixing everything, and they weren't about erasing the mistakes. They were about acknowledging them, about taking responsibility for the hurt that had been caused. And that, in itself, was a huge step forward. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she was speaking from a place of vulnerability, like she wasn't hiding behind the walls she had built all those years ago. My father, who had been quietly listening, nodded in agreement. "We've made our mistakes," he said, his voice gravelly. "I know that. And I know I can't fix everything with just a few words, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm here for you, no matter what." I felt the lump form in my throat as I listened to them speak. For so long, I had wanted them to say these things, to admit their mistakes, to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. But now, in this moment, I realized that I didn't need those words to heal. I didn't need them to apologize 1,000 times. What mattered was the change. What mattered was the effort. And I could see that they were making that effort. They were showing up in ways that went beyond words. And that meant something. I took a deep breath, then finally spoke, my voice a little shaky. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened," I said, the weight of the words settling in. "But I don't want to keep holding on to it either. I don't want it to define me. I don't want it to define us. I want to move forward, and I want to try to rebuild. I want to try to have a real relationship with you, even though I know it won't be perfect." There was a long silence after I spoke, a moment where it felt like the air itself had paused. My parents didn't say anything right away, but I could see the relief in their eyes. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was a moment of understanding, a moment where we all realized that we were ready to try, even though the road ahead would be uncertain. As we sat there, I reflected on how far we had come. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, I had been standing in a hospital room, hearing my parents give up on me, hearing them speak those words that cut deeper than anything else. I had spent so many years fighting against that moment, replaying it in my head, letting it shape who I was. But now, I could finally see that it didn't have to define me. I didn't have to be the victim of that moment anymore. I could choose to be something more. I could choose to be someone who forgave, someone who learned, and someone who moved forward. The process of rebuilding wasn't going to happen overnight, and I knew that. But the difference now was that I was ready to do the work. I wasn't waiting for a perfect resolution. I wasn't waiting for some dramatic change that would make everything better. I was learning to accept that healing takes time, that it takes patience, and that it's okay if the journey is messy. I was learning that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about accepting, about letting go of the hold the past has over you, so you can move forward. Months passed, and life began to feel more like it had before the old version of life, before everything had fallen apart. I still had my struggles. I still had moments of doubt, but I also had the knowledge that I was doing the right thing. I was working through the pain, not pretending it didn't exist. I was making progress, one step at a time. And I could see the change in my parents as well. My father was still quiet, but he was showing up more. My mother, though still a work in progress, was more open, more willing to engage in honest conversations. And that was enough. I started to spend more time with them, not out of obligation, but out of choice. We went to dinner together, watched movies, had long conversations that didn't always have a point but were real. There was no rush to fix everything all at once, and I think that was what made it so much easier. We were taking it one day at a time, learning to appreciate each other for who we were, not who we hoped the other person would be. The past still had its hold on us, but it no longer defined us. We were no longer living in the shadow of old wounds. We were writing a new story, one that wasn't perfect, but one that was ours. And I could finally say, with certainty, that I was okay with that. As the months continued to pass, I found myself stepping into a new version of my life, one where the weight of the past no longer held the same grip on me. There was a certain freedom in this, freedom from the bitterness, from the anger that had once fueled my every thought. But freedom didn't come without its challenges. As much as I had made peace with my parents, as much as we had worked through the hard conversations and the long silences, there were still moments where I was reminded of the scars that remained. Healing, I realized, isn't a straight line. It's more like a winding road, full of twists and turns, with moments of clarity and moments of doubt. One day, I found myself sitting in the quiet of my living room, reflecting on the year that had passed. I had spent so many years running from the pain, not knowing how to handle it, how to make sense of it. But now, as I sat in silence, I realized that I had stopped running. I had stopped fighting the emotions that had once felt so overwhelming. Instead, I was learning to sit with them, to accept them as part of who I was. I had learned that it wasn't about escaping the pain, it was about understanding it and using it as a tool for growth. A big part of this process had been reconnecting with myself. For so long, I had defined myself by my relationship with my parents, by their approval or disapproval, by the way they saw me. But as time went on, I began to redefine who I was, independent of them. I was no longer the person I had been in my childhood or even in my 20s, constantly seeking validation from external sources. I was learning to validate myself, to appreciate my own worth without needing anyone else's confirmation. And that in itself was liberating. At the same time, I knew that my relationship with my parents was still evolving. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was growing. We were learning to communicate in ways we hadn't before, to talk about our feelings without fear of rejection or judgment. My father, who had always been emotionally distant, had started to open up in small but meaningful ways. He would sit with me on the porch, silently watching the sunset. And sometimes we would talk about work, about the news, or sometimes just about the weather. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It wasn't filled with resentment. It was just the silence of two people being present in the moment, not needing words to bridge the gap. My mother, on the other hand, was the one who had made the most progress. I saw a softness in her that hadn't been there before. She was still the same person, still strong-willed and opinionated, but she was more willing to listen, more open to hearing me without immediately jumping into fix-it mode. For the first time, I could see the woman behind the mother. I could see her vulnerability, her regrets, and her hopes. It wasn't easy to let go of the anger I had held toward her for so long, but slowly, I started to see her as a human being rather than just a parent who had failed me. She had her own scars, her own battles, and understanding that was the key to unlocking the door to healing. And it wasn't just about them. It was about me, too. I was learning to forgive myself, to stop holding on to the guilt I had carried for so long. The guilt of not being the perfect son, the guilt of not meeting their expectations, the guilt of the anger I had felt toward them. I had spent so many years thinking that if I could just fix everything, if I could just make them proud, then everything would be okay. But the truth was, I had to learn to be okay with myself, with all my imperfections and flaws. I had to learn that I didn't have to be perfect, and neither did they. It wasn't a one-time decision. It wasn't something I could just declare and expect to be done. It was an ongoing process, one that took patience, self-compassion, and a lot of grace. I still had moments where I felt frustrated, where I wanted to lash out or give up, but those moments were fewer and farther between. They didn't consume me like they used to. I was learning to move through them, to sit with my discomfort without letting it define my actions. One evening, a few months after that dinner, I received a call from my father. He rarely called, and when he did, it was usually to ask about something specific: work, finances, or just a casual check-in. But this time, when I answered, his voice was different. There was an unfamiliar warmth in it, a tenderness I hadn't heard in years. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice a little shakier than usual, "about everything, about the mistakes I've made, and I just want to say, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the man you've become, and I wish I had told you that sooner." I was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that I didn't believe him. It was just that I had never heard him say anything like that before. My father wasn't one for praise, and his words felt like they were coming from a place of deep reflection. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't need his validation anymore. I didn't need him to tell me he was proud of me to feel worthy. I already knew I was worthy. I already knew I had done the work, and that was enough. "Thank you, Dad," I said quietly. "That means a lot to me." We didn't talk long after that, but it didn't matter. The words had been said. The moment had been shared. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace that I had been waiting for so long. It wasn't about getting everything right. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about understanding that healing takes time, and sometimes the most meaningful moments come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, simple exchanges that happen when we least expect them. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on how far I had come. I had spent so many years waiting for things to be perfect, for the perfect apology, for the perfect resolution. But now, I understood that life isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about learning, growing, and accepting the fact that we are all flawed, all doing the best we can with the knowledge and tools we have. My parents were no different. They were learning too, and they were trying. And for that, I was grateful. The healing process was far from over, and I knew that. But I also knew that I was no longer the person I had been when I first woke up from that coma. I wasn't defined by the past. I wasn't defined by the hurt or the anger or the years of silence. I was defined by my willingness to heal, to grow, and to forgive not just them, but myself as well. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. In the months that followed, something in me began to shift again. This time in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was subtle at first, small moments where I'd catch myself smiling or laughing without thinking about the past, without the shadow of my old pain looming over me. It wasn't that I had forgotten. I hadn't. But the memories no longer held the power they once did. The moments of anger and frustration weren't as frequent, and when they did appear, they didn't consume me the way they used to. I could see them, acknowledge them, and then let them pass. One of the biggest realizations I had during this time was that I had been carrying the weight of my past, not just because of what my parents had done, but because I had allowed it to define me. I had allowed my pain to become a part of my identity. I was the victim of their abandonment, of their emotional neglect. I had used that as a shield for so long, a way to justify my anger, my bitterness. But as time went on, I realized that this identity was no longer serving me. It wasn't helping me move forward. It was just keeping me stuck. The turning point came one afternoon when I was alone in my apartment, sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the world go by. I'd been thinking about the past, about everything that had happened between me and my parents, about the long road to healing. I could feel the familiar twinge of old emotions bubbling up, guilt, anger, hurt, but for the first time, I saw them for what they were. Just emotions. They didn't control me anymore. I didn't have to act on them. I didn't have to let them dictate my actions. I had spent so many years trying to make sense of my parents' actions, trying to figure out why they had hurt me the way they did. I wanted answers. I wanted closure. But the truth was, I had been looking for something outside of myself to fix me, to make me whole. I had been looking for validation, for approval, for recognition. But the real shift came when I realized that I didn't need any of that. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their apology. What I needed was to validate myself. I needed to forgive myself for holding on to the past for so long and for allowing it to define my worth. It was in that moment of clarity that I made a choice. I chose to let go. I chose to stop living in the shadow of the past, to stop using it as an excuse for my unhappiness. I chose to take control of my own narrative, to stop waiting for anyone else to fix me. I was the one who had the power to heal, to grow, and to move forward. I realized that I had been waiting for my parents to heal me, for them to give me the answers I had been craving. But I didn't need them to do that anymore. I had everything I needed within myself. The process of letting go wasn't instantaneous. It took time, and it took effort. It required me to confront the parts of myself that I had been avoiding, the parts that were afraid of being vulnerable, of letting go of the pain I had carried for so long. But little by little, I began to free myself from that weight. I started to embrace the idea that healing wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fixing everything that had been broken. It was about learning to accept the cracks, the imperfections, and moving forward anyway. I realized that my past didn't define me, and it didn't have to control my future. I was the one in control now. As I started to embrace this new way of thinking, I noticed that my relationship with my parents began to shift as well. It wasn't that they had changed dramatically, it was that I had changed. I was no longer holding on to the past, and that allowed me to show up differently in our interactions. I wasn't seeking their validation anymore, and because of that, I was able to engage with them in a more authentic way. I remember a conversation with my mother one evening, sitting in the kitchen over a cup of tea. It had been a long time since we had such an open conversation, one where we didn't talk around the issues, but dove straight into them. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice tentative, "about how much I've taken for granted, about how much I've hurt you without even realizing it, and I'm sorry. I know I can't undo it, but I want to be better. I want to be the kind of mother you deserve." Her words were simple, but they meant everything. For so long, I had waited for this moment, for her to admit her mistakes and show me that she understood the pain I had endured. But now, I realized that it wasn't just about her saying the right words. It was about her willingness to try, to show up in a way she hadn't before. And that was enough for me. I didn't need her to be perfect. I didn't need her to fix the past. I just needed her to be present, to acknowledge the mistakes, and to try to do better. "I'm not perfect," I told her, "and neither are you. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to rebuild, and I want that for us too." It wasn't a grand moment of forgiveness. It wasn't a magical fix to all the years of hurt. But it was real, and for the first time, I felt like we were both speaking the same language. We were no longer tiptoeing around our past. We were acknowledging it and choosing to move forward together. With my father, it was different. He was still the quiet one, the one who didn't always know how to express his feelings. But over time, he began to show me in small ways that he cared. He would call to check in, ask about my life, and tell me he was proud of what I had accomplished. He never said the grand apologies my mother had, but his actions spoke louder than words. And as much as I had wanted those grand gestures, I realized that what mattered most was the consistency of his efforts. He was trying, and that was all I could ask for. The more I worked on myself, the more I saw my parents in a new light. They were still flawed. They were still the people who had made mistakes, but they were also the people who had given me life, who had shaped me in ways I couldn't fully understand. They were human, just like me, and they were doing the best they could. And as much as they had hurt me, they had also loved me in their own way. It wasn't perfect love, but it was love, and for the first time, I could accept that. As I look back on everything that had happened, I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it. It was about taking the pain and the mistakes and turning them into lessons, into opportunities for growth. And while I wasn't finished with my healing journey, I knew that I was on the right path. I had learned to let go of the things that had been holding me back. I had learned to forgive not just my parents, but myself as well. And in that forgiveness, I had found freedom. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, the pain, the healing, the growth, I realize how far I've come. It's hard to believe that just a few years ago, I was a different person. A person consumed by anger, bitterness, and resentment. A person who couldn't see past the wounds of the past. But now, I can look back and see those wounds as part of my story, not as something that defines me, but as something that has shaped me. I've learned so much along this journey, not just about my parents, but about myself. I've learned that healing isn't linear, and that's okay. I've learned that it's okay to feel hurt, to feel pain, but it's also okay to let go of it when the time is right. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's behavior or forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to move forward, about freeing yourself from the grip of the past so you can live in the present and embrace the future. I've learned that, in the end, the most important relationship we have is the one we have with ourselves. We can't change the past, and we can't control what others do or don't do, but we can control how we respond. We can control how we choose to live, how we choose to forgive, and how we choose to love, and that's what matters most. Looking at my parents now, I see two people who are trying. They're not perfect, and I'm not perfect, but we're in this together. Our relationship will never be what I thought it would be when I was a child. It will never be flawless, and I don't expect it to be. But what we have now is real. It's messy. It's complicated, but it's real. And for the first time, I can say that I'm okay with that. There's still a lot of work to do. There will always be moments of doubt, moments of frustration, moments when the past creeps in and tries to take hold. But I know now that I have the tools to handle it. I know now that I don't have to let the past control me. I don't have to let the mistakes of others define who I am. I am the one in control of my own story. I am the one who gets to decide how I move forward. And that, more than anything, is the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. As for my parents, I've learned to love them for who they are, not for who I hoped they would be. I've learned to appreciate the ways in which they've tried to show up for me, and to forgive them for the times they failed. I've learned that love isn't perfect, and neither are relationships. But as long as both sides are willing to try, there's always a chance for growth, for healing, and for a future together. It won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it. So, as I move forward, I carry the lessons I've learned with me. I carry the forgiveness, the understanding, and the peace that comes with letting go. I carry the knowledge that, no matter what happens, I am enough. I don't need anyone's approval to validate my worth. I am worthy just as I am. And that, above all else, is something I will hold on to. I'm no longer waiting for a perfect resolution, for a perfect relationship, or for a perfect ending. What I have now is enough. What I have now is real, and it's mine. And with that, I can finally say that I am at peace.